So I just want to preface this with a few things. So there is a difference between restoration and rehabilitation. The general idea is that in restoration, you're actually returning places to the condition similar to what it was before, whereas rehabilitation may return it to a condition that's different than it was before. For simplicity, I'm going to use the word restoration in this presentation. It's just for simplicity. There is a difference. I also wanted to say that I really appreciate this group because we've got people who are documenting conditions historically, presently, and then projecting and modeling into the future. So we've got the stage for what's going on, and I'm the one who tries to like take what you guys do and put it into action. And I just think it's really important. Okay, and then as we've spoken, it's not just oil fields, it's all of the kind of human impact infrastructure and the way we live on the land that deals with things about restoration. So like even in Point Lay, I would kind of look at that from a restoration perspective of like trying to foster to come maybe recover it and keep these houses alive. It's all kind of interconnected with the engineering. So for some of the goals that we have, it's generally there's a component to it about the thermal stability of the ground. There's a vegetative component, which is both aesthetic, but it's also provides some insulation in the long term. And then, of course, for wildlife and hydrology tie into this whole concept of what we're trying to go for when we restore an area. So I was just going to talk about some oil field disturbances that we see that are common and typical. In the upper left, you have an old exploratory well pad. So these they aren't being built so much these days, but they could happen again. But the idea is that people go out, they take an ice road in the winter, they build. Sometimes this one has an access road. Some of them are just isolated pads in the tundra. Build a gravel pad, drill for oil, and say, "Oops, nothing here," or "It's not good enough." Pull all the metal infrastructure, take out all the contaminants, remove most of the gravel. Not all of it, because if you removed all of it, you end up with a square lake. So you end up with these kind of gravelly, it depends on the site how gravelly it is, and I'll get into that a little more. The second one, middle top, is a partial pad removal. So this was adjacent to an existing pad. So the existing pad is on the top of the picture, and then the partial removal is the section below. With gravel pits. So of course, there's all this gravel being removed from the ground. The agencies would like to see those pits recovered in some way. Oftentimes they're turned into lakes for wildlife habitat, and I keep wondering where we're going to put all the gravel when we need to move it again out of the tundra in the long run. Lower left is a spill site. I generally don't deal with the spill sites. Tim Cater, ADR, is kind of he's the master of that work, but I'll just touch on what it is. And then in the middle bottom, it's really people drive off the road for various reasons. Just like people get in car accidents anywhere else, it happens here too. And so you end up with tire tracks in the tundra. And then in the lower right is an example of a trench that was put in the oil field. And this is usually done for electrical lines going under the road so you can get tall equipment through the road. So I just wanted to talk about like what we've done over time. So a lot of soil testing was done early on, and then when we started getting the same kind of results over and over again, we decided there was no need to do soil tests at each site unless we suspect salt in the soil, and then we might do some testing to see if there's saline conditions. We've done some elevation monitoring in the past. Sometimes when you go out to a site and you do end up in a square lake, you can do all the elevation monitoring you want, but we're not going to take gravel back out onto the tundra and fill the hole. So we then also decided the elevation monitoring wasn't, and it was relative elevations relative to the adjacent tundra. We've done transplanting of aquatic grasses. That's still going on. Transplanting of tundra plugs. This one is kind of still an option that we have. There was I'll talk about it in a little bit about what the implications of that one. Seeding with native grass cultivars, indigenous seed collection. On our walk yesterday, those who were on it, we talked a little bit about that seed collection, doing willow staking, and then testing like how much gravel we should remove from different areas, transplanting tundra sod, and then also using pre-vegetated mats. So I'll go through some of these. So some of the challenges we face, we get these salt crusts often on the surface of soil, especially when we have organics at a site. So if sometimes organics are brought in to spread, like overburden is what the dirt workers call it. And we end up with these salt crusts, and they are not like calcium carbonate salt crust. It's some other form of salt crust, but sometimes it prevents plants from being able to establish. Of course, we have the short cold season. This picture in the center top was taken in June this year, kind of down by Galva. Sometimes we have really high ice volume in the ground. So this shows some ice lenses. And then on the right, in that upper right picture is an ice wedge. So you've got the massive ground ice, you've got the core ice, you've got ice lenses, and so dealing with how much ice is under the ground. And of course, this is something we keep talking about, is we don't always know how much ice is under the ground. You've got landscape perspectives, you've got some boreholes, but we generally aren't doing boreholes to test every location. We have low soil nutrients. So when we did the soil testing, we're really low in nitrogen and phosphorus. It's just the soils here just don't have much. And when you do add phosphorus, it tends to get absorbed really quickly and bond with the soil particles, so it doesn't become available to the plants. So that's a tricky one, is getting soil nutrients so you can get plants to grow. Soil textures can be really challenging. Sometimes we have really gravelly conditions. Sometimes we have this still, and you'll see it on our Dalton highlight thing. It just becomes this kind of bare, hard silt mat, and I don't know why one spot grows vegetation and another doesn't, but these silts sometimes can be problematic too. And then finding a source for sod can be really, really tricky. And I will talk about tundra sod. Did I just do one or two? Okay, so transplanting aquatic grasses, this one actually works really well. If you can actually take aquatic grasses out of one location and put it in another, and the location you take them from, as long as don't take them all, you just take some, it'll recover on its own just fine. And we can transplant them, and as long as you have really wet conditions, they will grow really well. It's a really nice thing, but it is labor intensive, going and digging up plants and moving them. It depends, how many people you have and how much time you have and how much money you have about how much you can transplant. Seeding with native grass cultivars was a technique that was pioneered in the 90s by Utiqiagvik as a form of restoration. And it seemed to do really well. The grasses grew. And there was also a concept that some of the grasses would grow and then die off and other colonizers would come in. In our experience, this hasn't worked very well. So in this upper middle picture, you can see what looks kind of like dead grass. So sometimes even when they die, we don't get other colonizers. So I'm curious if there's some kind of root exudate or something going on that's preventing other colonizers from moving in. So we're not seeing a lot of colonization where we planted grass. And in the upper right photo, that is a monoculture of seeded grass. And so, yes, it's green, but it doesn't look like the tundra. And it's not going to shift into tundra for, it may delay the recovery to a tundra ecosystem even longer than if you just left it there. So we have moved away from seeding native grass cultivars in most of the locations that we're using. And there's actually a whole list that AVR developed. It's like 12 things long, points why using native grass cultivars is not a good idea. Tundra sod plugs, the idea is that you transplant some plants in and they will colonize from the location you transplanted them into. You have to have a source. So years ago, Phil, maybe you remember when the tundra plugs were pulled, it was like in the early 2000s or late 90s. We went back, I think it was like 15, 20 years later, and looked at where the plug donor locations were, and they were like golf holes. They hadn't filled in, nothing had grown in, they were just there still. So you need to take your plugs from somewhere that is going to be disturbed generally, or somewhere that's just not going to be impacted by having a bunch of holes in the ground. Indigenous seed collection on the bottom middle, that's Tim Cater out there collecting seed. It is very labor intensive, back-breaking type work. And then you need to scarify the seeds, you need to get them clean, bring them back, and then when you seed with them, you don't have much, so you have to be really careful. So in the bottom right is an example of where I did these little square meter plots all over a pad. So I could do these little patches of indigenous seed to grow. And that's labor intensive as well. So all of this just takes a lot of time and effort to do. Willow staking is a pretty common practice in conditions where willows are appropriate. right? So usually it's some kind of riparian zone, stream bank, adjacent to stream banks, or other locations where willows are already growing. I just got a call from a colleague who was saying, hey, I need your advice on these willows. We've had 19,000 willows and the trees are broken. They're all starting to break dormancy. What do we do? And so just the whole logistics, you're supposed to harvest them in the winter, keep them cold and dark until you're ready to plant them. We pull them out, transport them, carry them in bundles out into the field and stake them, which is also a ton of work. In the upper right, this is a spot we're going to drive by tomorrow where we staked a couple hundred willows. And actually, I didn't think they also broke dormancy, and because I buried them in the snowbank up here, and the hopes the snowbank would last, and it didn't. So anyway, they are surviving. Gravel with trials. This one is something that I've been thinking on for a long time. So a lot of these plans that are made to remove gravel from the oil fields are made without input from somebody like myself, and so there's just a standard. Is move the gravel to about 6 to 12 inches above the surrounding tundra grade, knowing you're going to have some subsidence. They're not accounting for ground ice. So in my opinion, you should look at it from a landscape perspective, and in some conditions you can tell whether it's dry or wet, or it's an old drained lake basin. If you're going to have high ice volume, then you're going to want to remove less gravel, so you're going to have more subsidence, or in a drier area, remove more gravel because you're going to have less subsidence. And this piece of the puzzle has not yet been integrated into how things are performed. The gravel of trials are somewhat informative, basically removing it close so that your result as close to tundra grade is the best, but you have to do this ice prediction to get it right. Transplanting tundra sod, I'd say is probably the most successful thing. You get immediate vegetation, you get immediate thermal regulation and coverage by this thick tundra sod. And it can also do a lot of help for water management. It is super labor intensive. So if you can move it with heavy machinery, great, but not all conditions can you get heavy machinery into an area that you need to restore. So we do a lot of work by hand. We'll see a bunch of that on our drive south. Last year we hit 84 spots along the coastal plain, and this is my crew last year putting in tundra sod. The kids love the work, but it's a lot of work. Pre-vegetated mats was it was an inspired experiment. So I'll credit Bill Strieber with when he was at BP bringing in a panel of experts to evaluate the whole tundra rehabilitation program, look at what we're doing and what we might do. And so one of the participants, Sue Galadowicz, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota, came up with this idea of using pre-vegetated mats, collected seed, took it back to her lab in Minnesota, grew these mats, and in the bottom, this picture here, you can see the roots that grow when you grow them just in a peat medium. And so these mats you can just pick up because the roots will hold them together. And then I installed them, and we're going to visit that site today where they were installed. I'm actually really excited to see how they look today. And this is both a water management technique and also creating a thermal blanket and immediate vegetation. Okay, so transplanting tundra sod, I just wanted to kind of explain the whole process so that when people hear, oh, well, we should use tundra sod, what's involved to do. Harvesting in the upper right, I worked with the folks here at NES, Northern Energy Services. The guys manufactured these cutting blades. I'm afraid to touch buttons I can't see. So this part right here is actually this is a cutting edge. So they lay the bucket down on the tundra and press down just like a biscuit cutter and cut the edges of the tundra sod and then scoop it up with the excavator bucket. And then it would get moved. In this one, I really wish it was moving. Okay. Is that for the 15 or do I have 7 minutes?
She's got 7 minutes.
Okay, so
but I need
you scoop it up, you take it here, we have big mats here, it goes on to a loader that takes it to a truck, and then we stored it at the Franklin Bluffs pad. And this is about 2/3 of the sod we harvested. It filled about this area, we've been using it up. And then you store it there, and then you can move it with heavy equipment or by hand. So these are a couple of photos. This is actually where we gather up the bits that are pushed aside in the big Oxbow gravel pit. And then this is out on the Dalton Highway with my crew, who's awesome, going in almost waist deep in water collect it. So this one should be a video. No, okay, whoops. I guess I'm not gonna have any of the video. So I wanted to show some video of how it goes, but anyways, showing it being transferred from the excavator onto the loader. It's very muddy, dirty work. Loading it onto the trucks, unloading on the trucks, finding a storage spot, finding an available gravel pad to put it on, can be tricky. Yeah, there's all the sod that we harvested. This is just one sod harvest. Technique. I think Bill's mentioned it a few times. Technique actually is an indigenous knowledge technique used for insulating ice cellars and also building sod homes way back in time. And so Charlie Hobson was the one who came up with it originally he's from Utiqiagvik, and it was brought to the oil fields. I learned that technique there. I actually brought it back to Faro to the youth there, which was really fun building that heritage Tundra garden. Yeah, that's where it originated. And the timing is really tricky. So like I just got a call last year from the North Slope Borough saying, hey, we're going to open up the MS3 pit further. Do you want the sod? And I'm like, yeah, I want it, but who's going to pay for it? Unless there's a project going on right then. So it is really tricky. There's no like state fund to like harvest sod and set it aside for future projects because you just don't. Nobody wants to pay for that.
The speaker's not there, so if you want to talk that side, your voice will have
Got it. Okay. Billy, could you just turn that computer screen a little bit towards me so I can? And there was another question. I can keep going, and we can. Where is the computer so I can?
Right here.
Got it. Is it gonna go? Can you just advance my slides for me?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. So this is what it turned into. It's a big gravel pit. Just wanted to show the after, right? And we'll drive right by this gravel pit. There is a state requirement now to stack up organics along the edges of any disturbance in a gravel pit, so you don't end up with thaw propagation going into the tundra. But there was plenty left. Our harvest location was like right here. And then they opened up much bigger than we couldn't harvest more than that. It took us 24 days to 1.1 acre. And the technique you're using now is much faster and much more efficient than original techniques. We keep improving on it. Next slide. So this is a video. Is there any way to make that play?
Yeah, actually, does it have sound?
Rig mats on the tundra because we couldn't get the equipment out without the rig mats, so that's a whole lot. And then what we were doing it on pallet, move it on pallet, set it down. Oh, arduous process. And yeah. And then once we get to the storage site, we pull it off the truck. We've got to have somebody on the ground, on the ground, on operator. Getting guys dated out and crying out. So turnaround time on truck roll. Okay, next slide. Oh, God, you're gonna go. Say it again.
How many people have that? There's at least three, driver, the guy.
You've got the laborer on, you've got the driver, sometimes it's the laborer, you've got the operator of the person picking it up. And then on the receiving end, you have to have an excavator operator, a laborer, and that truck driver also comes, so that's 5 people.
And you making sure I go right?
Yes,
Right.
and also I run around after when they take the excavator and they scoop it off the truck. So this was a technique one of my workers came up with this because we wanted to deliver like 1 slab here and 2 slabs there. So we had the excavator on a truck and we just moved them together. So unfortunately 2 of my workers were flaggers, like they had their thing, and so they flagged the Dalton Highway so we could do this, and then they drive to the next spot, pull up next to each other and do this again. And so when we're doing it mechanically, whether it's mechanical or hand, I'm running around on the ground, picking up all the scraps and bits and pieces that break off and shoving all the cracks full. So by the end, I'm usually my backwards. Okay, I really wish I could hire a massage therapist. So this is another video, if you could play it. This just shows the hand labor technique. So a lot of you guys were wondering about the bread knives. So you can see the bread knives in their hands. We go, we cut a piece, we carry it out into the tundra. And it's just over and over and over again. Here in this spot, this ground was really stable and hard, so we didn't need to lay down pathways, but in most places we have to lay down some kind of geogrid pathway to not damage the tundra as we're carrying this back and forth. Okay, next slide.
And what are you recovering here? What is the impact that you're?
This is the fiber optic trenches that were laid from Coldfoot or from Dead Horse to Coldfoot, and we will stop and see those tomorrow.
Stop.
Yeah, you don't need to stop it, but it's interesting. I think it, yeah, does that weird thing.
How many miles of fiber optic trench are you trying to restore?
In this particular product, 240 miles, and 75 miles of that has 3 trenches, and the rest of it has 2. So it's not just one, it's multiple. This is another video, it's really short. This just shows somebody, I think, or no, maybe it's the next slide. Yeah, there you go. This just shows in the trench, what it looks like in the trench, and somebody, and this piece was maybe not cut quite right, but if that is the technique, is we shove it down in there, and then you have a continuous surface across. We can't fill 240 miles of trench, so we do it in select locations, and I might be able to talk about that on the next slide.
Are you dewatering the trenches?
In some instances we are, we actually don't dewater because dewatering is so complicated and the permitting is really tricky. And then when you take the water out, where you put it is really difficult to find a spot where you're not going to damage tundra by squirting water out. So a lot of times when we're backfilling, so in some of the places, so this is the location that's just south of Dead Horse, a giant hole. And so we backfill this in places that are water filled, we fill and squirt the water by the fill. It's not a great technique because the fill gets really wet and soft and it's hard for the heavy equipment to manage, but watering is beyond. What we need is a truck. You have to dewater into a truck and then you have to find a disposal site. And that adds a layer of logistics and cost that's kind of beyond us. So this is what it looked like before when we had a combination of thermal erosion and mechanical erosion. So water movement and subsidence all kind of mixed up in one big pile, plus some really poor techniques from earlier people who decided to try to shove straw walls in the trenches, which caused like further erosion. Next slide. And then some folks got to see it yesterday after. This is all mechanically laid sod. And now when you drive by, if you look out, you think that that's just tundra, but it's actually sod that we placed. And so far, 3 years later, it's holding up thermally. Where we have the sod. Next slide. Yeah, that's the outline. So you can tell, if I didn't put that outline there, you'd have a hard time telling the edges of what we laid versus what's natural. Okay, next. Okay, so in the takeaways of doing this kind of work, I'd say, elevation monitoring, soil testing, tundra plugs, as I mentioned, is kind of a questionable one, and seeding of native grass cultivars are all ones that we've kind of moved away from. Of course, transplanting aquatic grasses and tundra sod have been our most successful. It's just a limited supply of material to be able to do this. And then we're still working on willow staking and indigenous seed collection, trying to find somebody who will pay for indigenous seed collecting, people for days collecting seed and processing it. And then the pre-vegetated mats, the dream is to have somebody here in Dead Horse have a greenhouse and grow pre-vegetated mats for this type of work. Next slide. Any questions? I found that this year on the mountain, that question marks now.